Okay, so now we're going to look at the development of moral reasoning. This is really a kind of key area of developmental psychology, not necessarily in relation to forensic psychology, although it clearly has kind of big applications in this area. But it's kind of a cornerstone theory, an idea in the area of developmental psychology more generally. So what we're going to first do is just define what moral reasoning is. So it's the process by which an individual comes to a decision about what is right and what is wrong. So how do you reason that out? What are the reasons for deciding to do something that you believe is moral versus condemning something that you believe is immoral? So that reasoning is kind of coming up with the justification or the explanation for some kind of moral decision. There's two key theorists that we're going to introduce. The first one is Jean Piaget, and the second is Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, these both worked in very similar ways in terms of developing stage-based approaches to moral developments. They each came up with a stage-based approach where they assumed that people work through different levels and different stages of moral development in terms of how they reason their decisions about what is moral and what is right and what is wrong. So just if we start with Piaget, he was interested in behaviour rather than thought. So he was interested in how children construe what's right and what's wrong, so understanding the rules, understanding responsibility in terms of blame. So when someone is behaving in a particular way, do they infer or attribute blame about kind of why certain things happen? And do they understand justice in terms of the repercussions and if we're going to apply this to the forensic realm, then kind of the potential sentence or the kind of maybe the severity of a crime. About the behaviour, so looking at repercussions as well as just behaviour. Now, Piaget suggested that perceptions of morality change over time, and that we move through two different stages. So the first stage is referred to as heteronymous morality, or it might be referred to as moral realism. The second stage is referred to as autonomous morality, or moral relativism. Essentially, the difference between these two things is that heteronymous morality, typically kind of very early in childhood, is based around very black and white thinking. So morality is imposed by kind of external rule makers and enforced by them as well, and that perceptions of rightness and wrongness, or the definitions of rightness and wrongness, are set in stone. They're absolute. So what this means is that when someone is behaving in a way that is known to lead to a punishment, that is seen as being a negative or an immoral behaviour. If something isn't met with punishment, then that's assumed to be a moral or a correct behaviour. So the idea of imminent justice, punishment being swift, is really important. It's a real kind of core idea of heteronymous morality. And the idea that the punishment severity should match the wrongdoing. So for example, stealing one sweet in a corner shop would be punished to a lesser degree than would physically attacking your sibling, for example. There's two very different offences, if you like, and for that reason the punishment needs to fit the crime. So these ideas are really key to heteronymous morality. Looking at autonomous morality, Piaget said that this was kind of coming to fruition around the age of 10. This is where children begin to kind of individualize the rules slightly. So morality becomes individual in that we know that people make them and break them, and rules can change over time. So it's not just that rules can change over time, but rules can change between people. So this is maybe where you see children trying to play parents off against one another because they know that their father and their mother may have different perceptions of what's right and what's wrong. Instead of just punishing behaviour at this stage, punishment is linked to perceptions of malice or intentions. This is where intention starts to matter more than behaviour. So for example, as a very young child, if you accidentally hit your sibling because you're moving in a particular way and your arm kind of flies up and you hit them in the face, just by the virtue of the fact that you've hit them, that would be seen as an immoral act. Now, when children get to the autonomous stage of morality, just the action of hitting the sibling isn't in itself an immoral act. It's whether there's an intention to hurt. So if someone catches you by accident, that therefore is not an immoral act because there was no intention and no malice meant behind that. And the idea here around kind of the resolution of conflict is that instead of some kind of external arbiter coming in and solving conflict, you then solve conflict by negotiation and compromise. So again, getting around this idea of absolute wrongness and rightness and turning that into a more individual level discussion. Now, Kohlberg built on this really by looking at the cognition behind moral reasoning. So instead of just looking at the way that children play, which was how Piaget came up with his stages, Kohlberg was looking at how people reason, how children in particular make sense from a cognitive perspective, what's right and what's wrong. So he came up with a 6-stage theory that was based across 3 different levels of morality. So 3 levels with 2 stages in each level. And he used different moral dilemmas to elicit different explanations for moral and immoral behaviour from his child subjects. So what I'm going to do is quickly show you an example of one of these dilemmas. It's called the Heinz dilemma, and then get you to think a little bit about what the right and what the wrong answer might be, or what the right and what the wrong solution might be to this dilemma. Okay, so the solution to the Heinz dilemma really isn't straightforward. We know that stealing the drug would be contrary to the law, so theft is a criminal offence. So by virtue of the fact that Heinz would be punished for that, then from a very early kind of heteronymous view of morality, that would be an immoral act. But if we think about things from a more individual level or a more autonomous perspective, it may be that the kind of emotional response to his wife potentially passing away means that he's able to reshape his sense of morality, and stealing the drug then becomes a moral act. There's obviously different considerations when we're making a judgment about the Heinz dilemma. Would it be any different if the person who was dying was a stranger rather than his wife? Do we think that the chemist or the person who's producing the drug should be subject to any criminal sanctions if the wife passes away as a result of not having access to the drug, even though that person has not necessarily done anything active to cause that death? That withholding of the drug no doubt leads to a deterioration in that condition and therefore leads to the death. So there's different considerations that we might be able to kind of bring into this decision, and how we come to that decision, how we reason that moral decision that we've made. It gives us an indication as to the stage of morality that we're at and how we are functioning at a moral level. So what Kohlberg did to develop his stages of moral development was to essentially interview a wide range of, well, I say a wide range, it wasn't necessarily a wide range, it was 72 boys from Chicago, and he kept following them up to see kind of how the development of moral reasoning kind of changed over time. And what he did was he presented to these boys 10 different dilemmas, just like the Heinz dilemma. These interviews lasted on average around 2 hours per interview, And the idea was to identify the different approaches that these boys had at different stages of their life to moral reasoning. So is it the fact that people are born with a particular sense of morality? Is morality inbuilt? Or does it develop over time, as Piaget suggested that it did? Now, these are Kohlberg's stages of moral development. We've got pre-conventional morality, which is based around the ideas firstly of obedience and punishment, and then individualism and exchange. So what can you get from other people by acting in a particular way? We then have stage 2 or level 2, which is conventional morality. This is based around the maintenance of, first of all, interpersonal relationships, but then later on of kind of good, coherent social order. And then we have level 3 morality, which is post-conventional morality. And this is where we start to think about more individual considerations. This is where we really start to individualize and autonomize our sense of morality. We might bend the rules a little bit depending on what our individual moral orientation is. So this is really where we get to kind of universal principles that guide our moral decisions, but no absolutes in specific situations. Just to very quickly give you an overview of each stage. So the obedience and punishment orientation is really about the avoidance of punishment. If something is punished, then typically the child will know that is something that they can't do or in immoral behaviour. At stage 2, there's an acknowledgement that individuals may have different moral rules or different kind of guidelines for what is acceptable behaviour. But essentially the aim is to still avoid punishment. So you're still trying to avoid doing something wrong rather than trying to reason a moral decision and a moral behaviour. At level 2, you've got stages 3 and 4, which again is around kind of maintaining, first off, good interpersonal relationships. So you're striving for approval from other people, and behaviour is seen and kind of conceptualised as being moral if it maintains strong interpersonal relationships, if other people see it as being virtuous. In terms of maintaining social order, there's an awareness that there are certain cultural values or cultural norms that are valued. Behaviour is seen as good if it maintains a sense of social order or community, or if it obeys the law of the land. So this is where you get maybe individual level or maybe cultural level actually senses of right and wrong. In the post-conventional morality stages, what you see is that there are different ways that we can act in specific situations. So there's an acknowledgement that laws might exist for these kind of social cohesion reasons. So kind of trying to achieve the optimum outcome for the most people, these kind of utilitarian reasons for having the law of the land. But there may be ethical reasons to break the law. So for example, in the Heinz dilemma, being able to save his wife may have been one of those reasons for being able to break the law. So if Heinz stole the drug like he did, we can probably assume that he's in stage 5 of Kohlberg's moral development. And then, like I've said before, stage 6 is about kind of universal principles, but then you can adapt them in each individual situation. So you have a moral compass. This really applies at an individual level. You start to kind of make more nuanced moral decisions based on your own sense of personal morality. Okay, thinking about moral reasoning in adolescent perpetrators of different types of crime. Typically what we see is that people who are involved in criminal behaviour at the earliest stage of life, so kind of before the age of 16, have very kind of underdeveloped moral reasoning skills. So they'll typically be trying to avoid punishment, whether that's with an awareness of individual differences in what's seen as right and wrong or not, or they're trying to maintain interpersonal relationships. So they're trying to maybe behave in a way that will get the credibility of their peers, maybe. And there don't seem to be any differences in the type of offending or the type of delinquency that's being engaged in. Essentially what we're seeing is kind of this avoidance of punishment and maintenance of interpersonal relationships without any kind of broader consideration of maintaining social order or kind of universal senses of human rights or morality. And what we see typically are different explanations of offending behaviour. So what you see is that those who are at stage 1 will be trying to kind of maintain that they weren't punished for it before. If we go through kind of stage 3 is, well, this behaviour enabled me to maintain a relationship with a partner or with friends or with my parents. But then as we get kind of more into kind of the post-conventional morality, you see things around kind of, well, this was right because of X, Y, and Z reason that might be very individual to the person giving that justification. So that's what we see with the stages of morality, and the justifications for offending behaviour being, again, an indication of the level that somebody is in Kohlberg's stages of development.